Welcome again to Jay's Analysis. I'm on the road and scheduled to be on a TV show to promote our TV show. And we're going to be talking today about Alexander Dugin's Fourth Political Theory. And it's a very controversial book. In fact, I've gotten quite a bit of ridiculous messaging and emails and suspicions simply because I interviewed Dugin about a year ago, and everyone is sort of wonderment. How did you interview Alexander Dugin? What happened? What did you do? I sent an email and I said, would you like to be on Jay's Analysis? So that was the extent of the dastardly plots of all of us Russian KGB people. And the reason that this is so preposterous is because the entire neoconservative establishment really has created this aura that this person is sort of running all of the wickedness in the world. I mean, it goes so far as Glenn Beck, in between crying and weeping, he's formulated the conspiracy theory that Alexander Dugin and Nina together, Kopriyanova, that they run the alt-right, and Dugin is responsible for getting Trump elected. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, but I think what you'll see from this analysis is first of all that I don't totally agree with this book. We're just going to do an analysis of what its theory is, what it's projecting for the future, what Dugin sees as answers and possible paths for political philosophy to take. And so we're going to treat it as a geopolitical text like we would when we read Brzezinski, which I did some pretty in-depth analyses of the Brzezinski books a few months ago. So we're going to do the same type of thing with Dugin's book. Dugin's book, of course, as we've said many times, as Dugin says, it comes from the perspective of the land power, sea power view of Lord Halford Mackinder, the classical Western geopolitics type view. But rather than taking the Brzezinski perspective, Dugin takes the opposite Eurasian perspective, hence Eurasianism. And because it's the land power, the idea is, could there be alternate ways of the world operating or working that aren't centered around liberalism? And so we're going to talk about what he conceives of as Western liberalism, which is true, the Anglo-Saxon pragmatic liberalism of the West, the last several hundred years, and then contrasted with the land power of Russia. And we'll eventually, I think, also take a look at his book on contemporary Russian geopolitics. But for now, we're going to start with Fourth Political Theory. It's so controversial. Oh my gosh, what do we do? I mean, look at this right here. This is quite amusing, actually. Now, according to the National Review, that awful fake conservative neocon CIA publication, National Review, we are told that it's all a satanic cult. Now, I am going to disagree with aspects of Dugin's philosophy, especially towards the end of the book. So I'm not saying that I believe everything that Dugin says, but this hype and level of nonsense is pretty laughable, especially when you actually read the books and understand the position he's coming from, and then you see this kind of stuff and the hype that comes out of the Atlanticist establishment, particularly books like this, James Heiser's book, the American Empire Should Be Destroyed, and how evil Dugin is because of talking about there needing to be an end to American imperialism. Now, this is why these people, of course, can't figure out he's supposed to be a fascist, or he's supposed to be a communist, he's supposed to be a Marxist. Well, I mean, if you actually read the book, he's not any of those things, because the book is positing precisely that the three previous models of the 20th century of geopolitics have more or less failed. And communism, fascism, liberalism, and it failed in the sense that the only one that's dominant now is Western geoliberalism, globalism, as we might call it. So globalism is now triumphant, and what's funny is that this article attempts to critique Dugin on the idea of an immanentized eschatology, but Dugin is actually talking about the Fukuyama, right, Francis Fukuyama type immanentized eschatology, which says that all ideologies are dead. Now we have the total victory of non-democratic liberalism. This is the idea of Fukuyama. And so the irony here is that the immanentized eschatology is actually the philosophy of the West, of the liberal American empire, right? That we've got to export Americanism, globalism, total free trade for the Fortune 100, basically. Who else gets the advantages of free trade except the Fortune 100? The big banks, right? The banking empire. No, that's not an empire, right? No. It's Russia and some Russian philosophers that are behind the nasty imperialism, right? That's creeping and going to take over the world. No, not the West that funds the ISIS jihad or that funds the terrorists in basically any country that you could think of in the last 20th century. Not the Western banking elite that have funded the two world wars and attempted to destroy Russia through the exportation of Bolshevism and so forth. Right? That's not who we need to worry about. No, we need to worry about a Moscow professor, former Moscow professor Alexander Dugin. I mean, it just gets preposterous when you kind of actually have a sense of geopolitics. I mean, the Pentagon, right, has bases in how many countries, right? Almost every, like 150 something bases, right? Hundreds of bases in 150 something countries, right? And the idea that Dugin and Putin, this is the Russian empire that's going to take over the world, is absolutely preposterous. And so the National Review and Glenn Beck and these people, they're just 100% spouting propaganda and relying on neoconservative Cold War fears that all the commies and the Reds are going to get us, and that Putin and Trump colluded to steal the election from Hillary. This is the same propaganda. This is what these people think. This is how stupid these people are. So I just wanted to give you a taste of that. And of course, Glenn Beck is very much on board with this as one of the Glenn Beck and his Mormon gobbledygook, right? Right? Come on, right? Versus actual philosophers. Give me a break. So when we see things like that and the ridiculous fear mongering involved in this kind of nonsense, this is how we can get a picture kind of why the neoconservatives, neocons, and even the Democratic establishment, who are all run by the same people, why they make such a big deal out of Dugin and his books when they're not even that. I mean, there's a few places that I find troubling, particularly towards the end of the book, that I disagree with in terms of Dugin, that seem a bit Gnostic in terms of their influence. But I mean, Dugin is anti-evolution. Dugin is anti-transhumanist. And so where's the warnings about David Rockefeller from these people? Where's the warnings of Zbigniew Brzezinski's books? Right? No, those are never called dangerous or anti-philosophical or imperial, when Brzezinski even calls it the American Imperium. In numerous articles, essays, and books, he says, we are a giant empire. So for these guys to write books and say that, a Russian philosopher who has had probably a marginal influence in Russia, it's just preposterous. And I say that because in the last war of the world island, Dugin talks about specifically the Atlanticist networks of influence in Russia. The Carnegie Endowment and the CFR and their different publications that constitute kind of the fifth column of influence in Putin's Russia. So the idea here is not that there's this rising Russian empire. That's just not really realistic. And in fact, that's actually kind of going to be where I would have some criticism of Dugin, is that I think that a lot of the analysis here is correct, especially of where we've come and gone in the 20th century. He's absolutely right about the dominance of liberalism, and by that he's talking about classical liberalism. He's not talking about Hillary Clinton versus John McCain and Mitt Romney. He's talking about Adam Smith. He's talking about David Ricardo. He's talking about Thomas Paine, right? These Masonic leftists of the last 300-400 years that are the fathers of the idea of Americanism and Western pragmatism, what he calls Anglo-Saxon pragmatism. These traditions really, Scottish common sense philosophy, Thomas Reid, David Hume, John Locke, Jefferson, Ben Franklin, right? All these Illuminists, Satanists, and rationalists, these are the real Satanists. Okay, they're the ones that built America and this Enlightenment experiment, which is really globalism 2.0, or sort of the beta version of globalism. And then now America is expanding globalism, to the rest of the world. And so what Dugin is trying to argue and propose is that people in the West have a very difficult time understanding a different perspective, understanding a different metaphysic. For one, because metaphysics isn't even studied anymore. I mean, I studied this in grad school, and even in grad school, not many people are studying this. It's not even seen as relevant anymore because the whole focus in the West is essentially monetarism, pragmatism. What else? That's economic man, Homo economicus, right? I mean, that's what dominates the West, and that's what he's critiquing. So, if we want to understand the ideological tradition from which Dugin is postulating his critique, it would be figures like Oswald Spengler. It would be figures like, maybe even Greek philosophers like Plato, or especially Heidegger, whom Dugin sees as kind of the apex of the history of Western thought. That Heidegger encapsulates the logos of what it is to be Western man, and that he has really expressed it better than anyone else. Now, I have some disagreements with that. I mean, I'm not a Heidegger expert, but I did do quite a bit of phenomenology in my undergrad and grad school days, so I'm very familiar with Husserl and Heidegger. And so there's a lot, I think, to be appreciated there, in that Heidegger does understand life being and the ideas of logos and so forth, which is something kind of that had been lost in the West for various reasons. And so again, there's a lot to appreciate here. We don't have to adopt all of the entirety of the views. And there's a lot of gems in here. There's a lot to be mined, a lot of wisdom here, and so I think that's very telling. Is that the West is so mired in subjectivism and pragmatism and anti-metaphysics that they can't even really interact with this kind of a view. They can't. It's just impossible for them to fathom even the possibility of metaphysics, right? And so that's what Dugin will try to do, I think, in many cases, is try to use postmodernism against itself, try to turn it around against itself. And that's what we see him doing, I think, in some of these interviews and talks. When he was interviewed and had that argument with the BBC guy, and he was basically trying to turn postmodernism around on itself and say, well, hey, you BBC interviewer, if you don't believe that there's such a thing as truth, then what is wrong with traditional societies? You have no basis to critique traditional societies. Of course, I mean, I think it's a funny, useful critique. I try to do that a lot in, presuppositional critiques, transcendental arguments, things like that. But what's funny is that I think it kind of relies on, it relies on the expectation that the opponent, the leftist opponent, is going to be consistent, and they're not. So they're not necessarily going to follow their thought out to its logical conclusions, unless you mean by that going down this long train of thought into madness. I think that Western societies and the left are definitely totally willing to follow their thought processes down to the end result of post-humanism and transhumanism and self-destruction and nihilism. They're more than willing to do that. So in a sense, in the dark logic sense, they're willing to go down that path. So that's what we're going to look at in this analysis. This is not a substitution for reading the book. People need to, if you're interested in the topic of geopolitics, contemporary issues with Russia and the West, foreign policy, this kind of stuff, then you should probably read the book on your own. And then, of course, I'll get into later some more of critiques of the areas that I disagree with towards the end of the book.
I am a Russian agent. Many have called me out on internet. Well, I'm here to set the record straight. If you're wondering why is holding mustache on with middle finger, is middle finger action to all of America. You see, we have total hack of the elections. The elections in America have been run by the Russians. We have taken over. Joseph Stalin III has come back from the grave. As you can see, many books all in Russian. This is proof, CIA proof, that Russia have hacked American elections.
So, also my father was the Yakov Smirnov, and it's hard to do comedy in the Central Soviet Republic. Everything has to be okay by Moscow. You send the joke to Moscow. Moscow send back knife with the sniper rifle attached. Also, is a lot of bread line. In America, you have food stamp line. In Soviet Russia, we have food stamp you out line. It's very funny.
Welcome to Jay's Analysis, the full discussion as we continue with Fourth Political Theory by Professor Alexander Dugin. Dugin begins the book by talking about the center and the periphery and various influences that have formed his thought. And so he talks about how liberalism pretty much won the 20th century. And by this, he means the tradition extending back to classical liberalism, the Anglo-pragmatic tradition. And so conservatism, monarchism, traditionalism, fascism, socialism, communism, all have been defeated, basically, by modern liberalism. And again, by liberalism, he means the sense of the preeminence of an individual, an atomistic individual, the preeminence of the market, the preeminence of empiricism, the preeminence of democracy, the preeminence of natural rights, and basically anything else that you could list from the Enlightenment ethos. And so the thesis of the book is really actually quite simple. It will get very dense at times. It will get very esoteric in places. But the thesis is simply that the postmodern phenomena that we're experiencing is really the end result of the liberal presuppositions of classical liberalism, and they really don't lead us anywhere. They lead us to the nihilism of Baudrillard, the simulacra and simulation that I've mentioned many times. And what Dugin wants to do is deconstruct postmodernism and maybe turn it against itself, as we said in the first 20 minutes. And so he begins with, as we said, simple thesis, chapter 1, liberalism. He says there are three main ideologies of the 20th century. Left-right liberalism, that is, liberalism of America that is both, quote, liberal and conservative, but still liberal. Modern American political debates are all classed and couched within the phenomena of liberalism. In the 20th century, we also had communism, that is Marxism and socialism, and social democracy, and we had fascism, national socialism, Franco's national syndicalism, Perón's justicalism, and Salazar. And these regimes basically have all fallen. And what has dominated is the entire legacy of the Enlightenment, he mentions. The Cold War was essentially the final victory of liberalism. And now we've entered into a new, bizarre, self-destructive phase, he believes, that is post-liberal. And post-liberalism is the logical extension of the right's, quote-unquote, ideology of the Enlightenment, right? The atomism I mentioned before, where the subject's meaning and identity is found in supposed natural rights at the time of the Enlightenment, and over time this evolves into where we are now in postmodernity in terms of the interchangeable commodities, and that can include gender and whatever other kinds of identities, right? The corporate brands that a person buys make up that identity. The gender now that one chooses to be that day makes up that identity. And really these are all the outworkings of that postmodernism, which saw fit to remove all universal categories, all metaphysics. Now, in the post-liberal world, there is no meaning but what either the technocratic elite give or what the individual presumes himself to create on his own, which of course is all nonsense, but that's what people think, at least in the postmodern world, is that they make their own meaning. There's no meaning given to you from your culture, your heritage, your tradition, your biological makeup, your racial makeup, your gender makeup. All of that has been discarded, supposedly, under the postmodern world, and meaning is basically doled out from the top down through the mass media and public education. And in our case, it's humans as Gumby people or clay creatures that we supposedly can just mold into whatever image we want. I am a pansexual, trans-species, genderless, binary, trans-binary, clopper, brony person today. And it sounds absurd, it sounds ridiculous, but in a world where identity has been destroyed by design, humans still seek meaning and identity, and they'll seek it through whatever options are kind of thrown to them from the virtual abyss of the internet. And so we get cosplay and anime characters and My Little Pony and whatever else, video games, Zelda. This is what becomes the person's identity. They have this alternate life in the virtual world, which is gradually taking the place of identity and meaning in the real world. So we have the loss of the person into object, and this of course leads towards transhumanism, as Dugin points out on pages 19 and 20. Now, he says there are four positions that must be opposed that are all a result of this postmodernity. One is postmodernity itself, the philosophical position. Two is the post-industrial society. 3 is the liberal thought realized in practice, and 4 is globalization. So pretty simple thesis. And in that regard, yes, I would agree with Dugin that all those things have to be opposed. They're really just the end result of what Dugin also calls pure Satanism, the pure Satanism of the West. And by that he means this stuff. There's a small addendum I'll mention on page 24 that relates to what National Bolshevism was. And he said National Bolshevism emerged in Russia in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it sought to continue the legacy of the National Bolsheviks from the 20s. It was originally led by Lemonov and Dugin, although Dugin left the party shortly thereafter to form the Eurasian movement in 2001. The original National Bolshevik Party was repeatedly banned by the Western-funded Russian government, Yeltsin era, although its members continued to agitate. The ideology was an attempt to synthesize communism and nationalism, originally formulated by the participants of Germany's conservative revolution, such as Ernst Jünger, Ernst Niekisch. National Bolshevism was also present among the members of the anti-Soviet whites, that is the monarchists, the white movement, and even among the Soviet communists into the days of the Russian Civil War, although Lenin and Stalin opposed it. Regardless, elements of the ideology eventually reemerged in Stalin's brand of nationalism, which began to appear in the 1930s. So, in other words, an attempt to kind of turn Stalinism to the right. Now, when we get to the next section, Dugin is correct to talk about the evangelical millennialist right-wing groups, Bush, moral majority, right, these kinds of things, dispensationalism, John Hagee, and I think he basically calls them satanic freaks, or something to that effect. Yeah, it's not by chance that the heroes of postmodernity are the freaks, the monsters. Oh, okay, no, I'm sorry. He's talking here about the social justice warriors. The heroes of social justice, postmodernity, are the freaks, monsters, transvestites, and degenerates. And that's not by accident, and they're really kind of the dialectical opposite of the Protestant extreme sects of dispensationalism, Mormonism, and so forth. And that would relate to George W. Bush and the claim, God told me to invade Iraq, quoting Bush. And he's correct to see that all of these positions actually are antichrist. And again, here we get to the section of emphasis on Heidegger in Dugin's thought. And of course, Dugin has a lot of influence from Heidegger. And what we have is the loss of metaphysics in the West. And what Heidegger sought to do was recover the true metaphysical experience that encapsulates the logos of Western existential experience. I guess the what it is to be Western man and to do Western philosophy. And of course, Dugin sees that as summed up in Heidegger and the search for meaning and being, right? Ontology itself, penetrating the study of being. And that, in contrast to other thinkers like Husserl, this process of the study of metaphysics and being, which is quite unique to modern Western philosophy in terms of what all it's produced. Right, I'm saying that in contrast to ancient Egyptian metaphysics or ancient Hindu metaphysics. Modern Western thought and metaphysics, ultimately embodied in the figure of Heidegger, according to Dugin, has really produced a lot. But what happens is that it also creates a divorce of the subject and the object through the process of techne, or in the rise of technology. And this goes back to the Greeks, the idea of techne, and it ultimately, unfortunately, leads to liberal calculation thinking, nihilism, ever-increasing nihilism and nothingness, which lies at the end of all this, which is the oblivion of being and hopelessly pessimistic nothingness. And that's where, of course, basically where we're going with techno-nihilism in the West. And the West has now become this abyss of this black hole sucking everything else into it. And he mentions, of course, Spengler in the note on page 30. Obviously, Spengler is an influence. And because it's postmodern now, we've reached the end of ideology. Right? Ideologies don't really matter, as we're told, at least in the modern world. It's really commodification and quantification that matters, because it's supposedly we're moving towards the unipolar world, right, of Western hegemony, and not the multipolar world. Postmodernity's challenge is tremendously significant. It is rooted in the logic of being's oblivion and in mankind's departure from his essential existential, ontological, and spiritual roots. Exactly, right? Remove man from his metaphysical and spiritual being, and then place him into no meaning, right? A situation of no meaning and interchangeable, meaningless consumer goods and commodities. And ultimately what that leads to is commodification of people, and then not just the people, but the dividing up of the parts of the person, right? You get a microchip put in you. You get a transhumanist arm that's going to be your bot arm, supposedly, right? Because the system loves you so much that the Wounded Warrior Project is going to pay for you to have your bionic arm. So we're told, right? We move on to consider more Heideggerian thought and some Carl Schmitt and the notion of nomos. And this is interesting because we're going to discuss the idea of, let's talk about nomos first here. Nomos, of course, is law or principle. And for Dugin on page 34, we're looking at the works from Carl Schmitt that deal with the nomos of Earth in terms of international law, and the concept of the fourth nomos of the Earth, which is the relationship between political science and political theology with geopolitics and the new model of the political organization of space. And all of this comes, of course, from Carl Schmitt. And Dugin does have influence from these arenas, but they're not overriding. And I think it should be pointed out that there's basically all the ideologies of the 20th century that we've mentioned. Each one of these ideologies, Dugin says, clearly has a defined historical subject. So in classical liberalism, it is the individual. The individual is the goal of all liberalism. It is, however, often unaware of its identity as an individual. That is, what does that even mean to be an individual? This is a critique I've made many times, that individualism really has no meaning unless you have a philosophy of personhood to give individuation meaning, right? You have to be made in the image of God or something like that before the idea of what it is to be a person and thus an individual has any coherent notion behind it. But in classical liberalism, that's never given because, of course, of its secular origins. To become liberated, then, as Dugin correctly points out, ultimately means to be liberated from all things external to oneself. And so in all liberal theorists, and in particular he uses John Stuart Mill as an example, freedom is always negative, right? In other words, freedom from all external ideologies, external metaphysical principles, external legal principles, external jurisdictions, external tyrannies, etc., etc. It never can give a freedom for, right? It's not. This was my argument about personhood. It's not freedom to do this or to be that in any positive sense, because the whole presupposition of the position is just merely negative. And how could it be positive? Because if any person from this school of thought were to ever give you or tell you what it is to be an individual, they would be imposing their strictures and meaning upon you. Right? This is the absurdity of this position. It has no telos, it has no purpose. The individual supposedly creates his own telos or purpose, but of course that's meaningless nonsense, a drop of water into the vast abyss, void of space, right? Your finite meaning really has no significance whatsoever, because you appear and you're gone, right? In this worldview, you're dead. Then what? What did all your meanings mean? Right? It really meant nothing other than what? Just hedonism? I mean, what else do you have with this position? The second political theory, Marxism, its whole focus was class. The subject is class warfare, rich versus poor, right? And now we've entered in this kind of new phase where Marxism has kind of shifted into pure identity politic. That it's all the race politic, right? The white versus black issue. And so this whole chapter is Carl Schmitt and Heidegger basically restated, and some really interesting insights there. And he kind of does a critique of Deleuze and Derrida, and how they're obviously the kind of end result of postmodern thinking in their respective disciplines, literature especially, deconstructing all meaning. And then there's some interesting notions of critiques of what it is to be racist, and how everybody kind of thinks of Hitler in this, but that's not the only form of racism. In fact, liberalism, Western liberalism, is a kind of racism, because it assumes, in Dugin's interesting critique, it assumes that all societies must be made into the image of Western liberalism. So isn't that kind of a universalizing of a localized presupposition, and thus somewhat racist? Interesting. I would say there's a good argument to be made there. However, where I do start to have some disagreements with Dugin is page 46 and 47. And page 46 is where he really kind of states his own cultural relativism. Dugin says that societies can be compared, but we cannot state that any one of them is objectively better than the other. Such an assessment is always subjective, and therefore could be classed as racism. Why? Well, because we're always situated within some historical culture or society, and therefore if we ever try to say that one culture is superior to another, then we have committed a sin against this idea of racism. However, Dugin's own position of stating that there is no culture better than another is itself a cultural supremacy statement. So in order to make this statement, Dugin himself has to also presuppose that cultural relativism is not true in order to espouse cultural relativism. In other words, if Dugin were correct, then it would mean that his Russian bias in saying that no culture is superior to another is itself a philosophical precondition for cultural superiority, namely Dugin's own position. So that we have to reject, and that's, of course, why I think that there's still some areas that we can't accept in Dugin, in my perspective. That's not to say that I don't think he's a fascinating thinker and full of insights, but I think that given this section, pretty recently mentioned Spengler, we might have some of that cultural relativism from Spengler that maybe influences this section. But it comes up later in Dugin's book as well. So he does have some interesting discussions of ethnoi, and that what's happening to ethnic identities is that they're all kind of being destroyed through technological ethnocide, he calls it, which is basically, the more that Western norms spread, the more, the monoculture basically, it destroys the other cultures, which we've discussed and talked about and covered many times. Interesting, he says Marxism was based on religious myths. That's true. We knew that. We've talked about that in many articles and talks as well, going back to the medieval Joachim of Fior. And this is kind of well known now. Thomas Müntzer, these different characters who would influence the later Marxist revolutionaries in their kind of immanentized eschatology. And then, of course, he mentions Karl Popper, which I've talked about many times, the open society and its enemies, and how Karl Popper is inconsistent and hypocritical because he says that the open society essentially means that it must persecute anyone who's not open. So it's fundamentally nonsensical, but that's okay because it's not meant to be coherent. It's a tool of the Western elite, especially Popper, right? That's why... Who does George Soros name his institute after? Right? Karl Popper, right? The Open Society Institute. Social Darwinism. This is great critiques here from Dugin, and this is, I think, he has to be commended as far as I'm aware, the only modern geopolitical thinker who critiques Darwinism. He's correct to discuss the social Darwinist aspect of the market god and the free market worship of the mammon, this overriding zoological approach that everything is just the market. And I remember whoever that guy that has that used to have that market, Jim Cramer, the guy that's always pulling on his collar and screaming and yelling at the TV, kind of like the market version of an Alex Jones. I remember in an interview with Jim Cramer one time, he was saying, there's nothing wrong with the Western Illuminati because he says this, you can find this on YouTube, by the way. He says, yeah, maybe the Illuminati aren't so bad. And then in another interview, he says, it's all just social Darwinism. It's all just, clamor your way to the top and stamp on everybody else to get who gets in your way. That's what is the beauty of pure market forces and so forth. All this bullshit. Of course, that's all rigged. There's no pure market forces, as if that's how it really works. But that's what the libertarians and the anarcho-capitalists and the objectivists, they act like that's how the world really works. They don't talk about shadow banking. They don't talk about any of that stuff. Ayn Rand doesn't talk about any of that. I've read Ayn Rand's books. You don't get anything like that. You just get this presupposition that, it's private interest versus the state. That's the whole battle of history. It's like a reverse Marxism, basically. Marxism, it's the private corporations versus the people, and then in Ayn Rand, it's the opposite. It's just the genius corporate strategists versus the evil government collectivist minions. That's just dialectical bullshit. Interesting, too, he does mention Gregory Bateson, one of the preeminent MK Ultra doctors, and the ideas of linear growth. Before that, too, I should mention that there's weird notions in like free market theorists and strategists that you could just have this infinite growth and that there's no pushback and pullback. Like progress and growth is just eternal and infinite. And then concurrently with the market progress presupposition is the myth of social progress, right? That we just progress. There's a surplus and it will just continue forever and ever and ever. But as he correctly points out, this is all myth, because a lot of this is built on usury. A lot of this is built on, bullshit banking, which is not real. It's not based on, actual free market principles and all this stuff. It's really controlled by various elites, CIA, shadow banking, J.P. Morgan, the big boys, right? And so this is all mythology. And the idea of never-ending perpetual progress comes out of Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer and the Darwinians and their whole grand narrative myth, which none of that's true. So the next section, but anyway, he has a good critique of the idea of perpetual progress, and that we're never actually told what progress is. However, he does again restate his cultural relativism stance there on page 65. Page 66, he makes a good point that we must be truly pro-life. That's good. I agree with that. And in chapter 4, we talk about Hegel and different conceptions of time. Nicholas Berdyaev, and I don't really think these guys are that great. Berdyaev's a Gnostic. He's not some great political thinker that we should really pay that much attention to. But he does say that he thinks that the fourth political theory is not an invitation to, as if you could just step back in time. In other words, we can't just go back to Byzantium. We can't resurrect Roman Empire. That's not how the world works. It's never going to work that way, and time doesn't work that way, Dugin thinks. And so we kind of get a Spenglerian view here that you can never step back in time. I mean, you can have influences from the past, but you can never rebuild some ancient empire. And this is what a lot of the younger thinkers, I would say, who get involved in a lot of movements. I was this way in my 20s, very idealistic. You don't really have a conception of how things come and go. Empires live and die. They don't get reborn. You're never going to have New Byzantium per se. Now you might have a thing called that, but it won't be that same entity that existed in 1300. And part of the reason for that is because of where we are now in the political spectrum and the power spectrum globally. Right? We're not in the ancient world. We're not in the world of roving bands of marauders and pirates. We're not in the world of ancient medieval knights and crowns and so forth. We're in the modern world, and the power structure of the CFR and Trilateral Commission, which is all mentioned, right? That's who runs things. And so if you don't even figure that out, you're online LARPing about being a neo-Nazi, or you're LARPing about being a founder of New Byzantium, or whatever your particular Dungeons and Dragons fantasy is. It really doesn't mean anything. And so we have a discussion of different perspectives of what it means to have world order. And so from the Western Atlanticist perspective, it's basically that CFR perspective, right? It's the tragedy and hope, Anglo-American establishment, everything that I've discussed in the last 2 years from Quigley. Dugin basically states all that in the next few chapters. And it requires the ideas of manifest destiny, the Western Rights Project, right, the scam of human rights, that's all mentioned here, echoing kind of what F. William Engdahl talks about. The U.S., so it's called, so we could say, quote unquote, U.S., it sees itself as the as manifest destiny, that this by extension needs to extend to the whole globe, right? The ideological presupposition of America is just so great that it must replace all other cultures, and so all other cultures are judged and viewed from the vantage point of something very, very flimsy, by the way, right? What exactly does it mean to spread American ideals and human rights? What does that mean? Feminism? Does that mean abortion? Porn? What does this mean? Vaccines? Coca-Cola? Corn syrup? And so post-modernity is in other words, America is the postmodern imperium, is essentially where we're at. Universal Americanism. And this comes about through, he mentions one of these, American military political expert, Stephen Mann, who affirmed that democracy is a self-generating virus. Now, this is a guy who supports it. Stephen Mann's not he's part of the establishment. He's one of these Pentagon guys. And he says that we can use democracy as a virus to destroy other cultures. Yes, you heard me right. That is Stephen R. Mann, and that is at dtic.mil, government site. Chaos Theory and Strategic Thought. Let me emphasize that again. Stephen Mann, American military political strategist and expert, Pentagon guy. We can spread democracy as a self-generating virus to destroy traditional societies and cultures. Wow. You can't get any clearer than that. That is why we have to oppose this. Now, I'm not saying that Dugin has all the answers, but I'm saying that Dugin rightly recognized that that's the problem. What is the Western vision of the world? He says it's formed by TV. Exactly. And he kind of goes into the metaphysics of TV a little bit on pages 84 and 85. Something we've delved deeply into at Jay's Analysis, and I'm sure you all know that. This is an interesting quote. Even Frankfurt School liberal Habermas, who was once a classic leftist, says that if we do not at least preserve the barred spirit of the Enlightenment, or the belief in the ideals of the free subject and moral liberation, if we do not hold to this precipice, then we will fly off into chaos. So even one of the architects of the bullshit in which we now live admits we've gone too far. Now, you could debate whether he really believes that, but I think Habermas is totally just depraved, sicko, Frankfurt School degenerate. But is it possible that even though some of those, maybe some of those guys realize that, they're destroying everything doesn't fix everything? What is Dasein in terms of Heidegger? Well, my understanding when I took grad classes on Husserl and Heidegger was that Dasein was like life being, and Husserl's phenomenology had been too theoretical, too abstract, too sterile, and he had a whole class staring at a mailbox for an entire summer to do the bracketing intentional analysis of the mailbox. And Heidegger thought that this was just ridiculous, and so basically said that nobody interprets or understands objects in a completely theoretical framework. We all come to objects with a history of interpreting those objects, and those are presuppositions. And so because we all have these presuppositions about whatever the objects are, or anything that we're interpreting, it's impossible to have a completely, quote, neutral position or framework, and that's ultimately where Dugin's going to go towards the end of the book, is said that there's no place for this privileged neutrality. Now that's true unless we take into account theology, which I think is the big mistake that Dugin's not doing here, is that even though he's got a lot of good philosophical arguments and points, it's not ultimately based on historic Orthodox theology. I'm not denigrating Dugin's, whatever his views of Old Believer orthodoxy are. I'm just saying that Orthodox theology in the first millennium of the church has an explicit statement about judging cultures, right? I mean, read the Seventh Ecumenical Council, right? Read what was the Great Commission. Jesus says, "Go forth and convert the nations," and you can't do that unless you have some position by which to affirm that those nations must convert out of paganism. So that's, I think, the chief problem that I have with Dugin, is that it's not a position in which the church and the tradition of the church and the Bible essentially speak to and reform the world. And that's really the message of the prophets, isn't it? Isn't that what Isaiah prophesies? That the whole earth will eventually be converted to Christ. Isaiah says that many times. David says that. And so that requires, the ability to look at a certain culture and say, your culture is idolatrous and wicked. You can't keep, sacrificing 10,000 Amazonians, Aztecians on holy days, man. Chill out. Drop your athame. All right. Stop the ritual dagger cutting out baby hearts. All right, that's not good. But of course, it becomes difficult to see how, in the Duginist position, if I understand him correctly, how you could say that that's wrong. I guess we can't, right? We can't tell the Aztecs to stop cutting out human hearts and eating them, right? But that's not what Jesus says. So I'll take Jesus over Spangler. We do have some interesting discussions, though, as I said, of the theories of Dasein and Heidegger. But I mean, I'm not dissing Heidegger. I think he's insightful. I don't claim to be an expert in Heidegger. I have read Heidegger and I've taken classes on Heidegger. I've gone and met and heard live lectures from one of the top phenomenologists and Heideggerian specialists in the country, Dermot Moran, many years ago in grad school. But I also don't think that he's that big of a deal. Nor do I think Hegel's that big of a deal. Right? Some people really get into these guys, Hegel and Heidegger, and they think they're the bee's knees. But I think if you go and you read something like God, History, and Dialectic, and you look at the presuppositions of divine simplicity and how this just unfortunately affects all of Western thought, you really start to be a little less impressed with the wordsmithery and neologisms of Kant and Hegel and Heidegger, and even Husserl, who I do have a lot of appreciation for. Later Husserl basically just devolves into kind of Buddhism. So from a Platonism to a kind of Buddhism, ultimately this is worthless philosophy. Not saying they're not insightful or useful. I'm just saying that overall, in the long run, final analysis, the Bible's where it's at, not Husserl, not Heidegger. And you can tease out good arguments, though, from those guys. There's good transcendental arguments in Kant. But where Kant takes those arguments is not good. And that's why he'll discuss surrealism. He basically discusses all the Western philosophical movements and what their problems are, which I appreciate. That's the kind of thing that we try to do here at Jay's Analysis. Dugin does that somewhat in the book. But he reaffirms the presuppositions of sociology that I disagree with. Claude Lévi-Strauss, page 100, cultural relativism. I think that that's what has to be rejected here. Again, to make the statement of cultural relativism is to deny cultural relativism. It is a contradiction philosophically. Chapter 7, as we said, modernity leads to postmodernity. Yes, absolutely correct. He does correctly also note that the notion of civilization is a presupposition and it is ambiguous. I would agree. And he does draw, again, more insights from Spengler on pages 104 and 105. Good critique of the Enlightenment by Spengler. Yes, definitely agree with all that. Language is intimately bound up in civilization. Totally agree. Everybody should read the article from Leonid Savin, who is a kind of a right-hand aficionado, academically speaking, of Dugin's, on the Russian language and culture. I think is something to that effect. That's at Cadion. I've linked it and shared it many times, but just look up Leonid Savin articles on Russian Orthodoxy and Russian history and language, and you'll find those. And they're very, very good, and they fit well with this section of Dugin. And he points out too that the crisis of classical models of history, all of these analyses start from the presupposition of a liberal bias. The classical view, the economic view, the liberal view, the racial view of civilizations, these are all kind of premised on liberalism. Yes, absolutely. And he's basically saying that the philosophy of cultural analysis itself is problematic, and I would agree. Yeah, Dugin is analyzing the presuppositions in those disciplines, which not many people have done, and that's why I appreciate the presuppositional analysis. Right? I disagree with his conclusions, but who else is doing this, right? So we're about halfway through the book at this point, and I think here is a good place to halt the part 1, and next week I will finish, and you'll have a part 2. So quite a bit of heady philosophical ideas in this book that we're going to have to deconstruct, especially in the second half. So that's good enough for part 1. Thank you for listening, and next week we'll complete this book with part 2, and then probably move on to one of Dugin's other books on geopolitics.